Swanns Way, starting at page 222. Lucky. I know someone quite well named Ventois, said Swann, thinking of the piano teacher who had taught my grandmother's sisters. Perhaps it's him, exclaimed Madame Verdurin. Oh, no, Swann answered, laughing. If you had ever spent just a minute or two with him, you wouldn't ask. Then, to ask the question is to answer it, said the doctor. But he could be a relative. That would be rather sad. The fact is, a man of genius can be a cousin to an old fool. If this is so, I confess I would submit to any kind of torture to get the old fool to introduce me to the composer of that sonata, starting with the torture of associating with the old fool, which would be frightful. The painter knew that Ventois was very ill at the moment, and that Dr. Potain was afraid he would not be able to save him. What? Cried Madame Verdurin. Are there people who still go to Potain? Oh, yeah. Ah, Madame Verdurin, said Cottard, in a tone of witty repartee. You forget that you are talking about one of my colleagues. I should say one of my teachers. The painter had heard that Ventois was threatened with mental illness, and he declared that one could perceive it in certain passages of his sonata. Swann did not find this comment absurd, but it bothered him, for since a pure work of music contains none of the logical relationships whose alterations in language reveals madness, a madness recognized in a sonata seemed to him something as mysterious as the madness of a bitch, the madness of a horse, though these can indeed be observed. Don't upset me with talk about your teachers. You know 10 times as much as he does, Madame Verdurin answered Dr. Cottard, in the tone of a person who has the courage of her convictions and stoutly holds her own against those who are not of the same opinion. At least you don't kill your patients. Madame, he belongs to the Academy, replied the doctor ironically. If a patient would rather die by the hand of one of the princes of science, it's much more stylish to be able to say, I'm being treated by Potain. Oh, it's more stylish, said Madame Verdurin. So there's such a thing as style in illness now. I wasn't aware of that. How funny you are, she exclaimed suddenly, dropping her face in her hands. And I was such a silly fool, talking about it seriously without seeing you were pulling my leg. As for Monsieur Verdurin, finding it rather a strain to force a laugh over such a trifle, he contented himself with drawing on his pipe, musing sadly that he would never be able to rival his wife in a contest of amiability. You know, we like your friend very much, said Madame Verdurin to Odette, when the latter was wishing her good night. He's so unaffected. He's so charming. If all the friends you think of introducing us to are like him, you may certainly bring them. Monsieur Verdurin pointed out that Swann had not, however, appreciated the pianist's aunt. The man felt a little out of his element, answered Madame Verdurin. Now you wouldn't expect him to have caught the tone of the house already, the very first time, like Cottard, who has been one of our little clan for years. The first time doesn't count. It was useful for breaking the ice. Odette, it's agreed that he'll meet us tomorrow at the Châtelet. Will you pick him up? No, he doesn't want me to. Ah, whatever you like then, as long as he doesn't go and abandon us at the last minute. To Madame Verdurin's great surprise, he never abandoned them. He went to meet them wherever they were, sometimes in restaurants in the outlying districts where no one went much, yet because it was not the season. More often to the theater, which Madame Verdurin liked very much, and because one day at her house she said in his presence that on evenings where there were premieres or galas, a pass would have been very useful to them, that it had inconvenienced them very much not to have one at the day of Gambetta's funeral. Swann, who never talked about his distinguished connections, but only about those which were not very highly esteemed, which he thought it indelicate to conceal, and among which he had in the Faubourg Saint-Germain fallen into the habit of including his relations with the official world, answered, "I promise to take care of it. You'll have it in time for the revival of Le Don Chef. As it happens, I'm having lunch with the prefect of police tomorrow at the Élysée Palace." "What? At the Élysée Palace?" shouted Dr. Cottard in a thunderous voice. "Yes, and Monsieur Graviers," answered Swann, a little embarrassed by the effect his remark had produced. And the painter said to the doctor as a joke, "Do you have these attacks very often?" Generally, once an explanation had been given, Cottard would say, "Oh, I see, that's all right then," and not show a trace more of emotion. But this time, Swann's last words, instead of procuring him the usual peace of mind. Uh-oh, I just saw my mic flicker. Maybe you can hear me, maybe you can't. We'll see. Instead of procuring him the usual peace of mind. Oh, it looks like it's gone out. One second. This will be interesting. I still think it's out, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me. Okay. Instead of procuring him the usual peace of mind, raised to a fever pitch his astonishment that a man with whom he had dined, who had no official position, no celebrity of any sort, would hobnob with the head of state. "What do you mean, Monsieur Gravier? Do you know Monsieur Gravier?" he said to Swann, with the stupid and incredulous look of a policeman on guard at the palace, who is asked by a stranger to see the President of the Republic, and who, realizing from those words, "What sort of person is he dealing with?" as the newspapers say, assures the poor lunatic that he will be received immediately, and leads him to the special infirmary at the police station. "I know him slightly. We have a friend in common." He did not dare say that one of them was the Prince of Wales. "Actually, he entertains a good deal, and I assure you these lunches aren't in the least bit amusing. They're also very simple. There are never more than 8 at a table," answered Swann, trying to expunge what had seemed to be too dazzling in the doctor's eyes about his relations with the President of the Republic. Immediately, Cottard, trusting in the truth of what Swann had said, adopted the opinion concerning the value of an invitation to Monsieur Graviers, that it was not a very desirable thing, and could be picked up anywhere. From then on, he was no longer surprised that Swann or anyone else should visit the Élysée Palace, and he was a little sorry for him because he had to go to lunches with Swann himself, which Swann himself admitted were boring. "Oh, I see, that's quite all right then," he said in the tone of a customs inspector, who, though suspicious a moment before, after hearing your explanations, stamps your passport and lets you go through without opening your bags. "Oh, I believe you. I'm sure those lunches must not be very amusing, and it's good of you to go to them," said Madame Verdurin, who saw the President of the Republic as a bore, to be especially dreaded because he had at his disposal various means of seduction and compulsion. which, if employed upon the faithful, would be quite capable of making them desert her. Apparently, he's as deaf as a doorstep and eats with his fingers. In that case, certainly it must not be much fun to go there, said the doctor with a touch of commiseration, and recalling that 8 was the number of guests at the table. Are these intimate lunches? He asked sharply with a linguist's zeal more than a snoop's curiosity. But the prestige of the President of the Republic in the eyes of the doctor ended by prevailing over both Swanns' modesty and Madame Verdurin's animosity. And at each dinner, Cottard would ask him with interest, Will we be seeing Monsieur Swann this evening? He's on personal terms with Monsieur Gravy. Is he in fact what one would call a gentleman? He even went so far as to present him with an invitation card for the dentistry exhibition. This will admit you, along with anyone you might like to bring with you, but they don't let dogs in. You understand. I tell you this because some friends of mine didn't know and kicked themselves for it afterwards. As for Monsieur Verdurin, he noticed the bad effect produced on his wife by the discovery that Swann had influential friends whom he had never mentioned. If they had not arranged a party somewhere, it was at the Verdurins that Swann would join the little clan, but he came only in the evening and almost never agreed to have dinner there despite Odette's earnest requests. I could even have dinner alone with you if you would like that better, she would tell him. And what about Madame Verdurin? Oh, that would be easy enough. I would simply tell her my dress wasn't ready or my cab came late. There's always a way to manage it. You're very sweet. But Swann said to himself that if he showed Odette by agreeing only to meet her after dinner, that there were other pleasures he preferred to the pleasures of being with her, a long time would pass before her appetite for him was surfeited. And, too, since he infinitely preferred to Odette's kind of beauty the beauty of the little working girl as fresh and plump as a rose with whom he was smitten, he chose to spend the beginning of the evening with her, being sure of seeing Odette afterward. It was for the same reasons that he never agreed to have Odette pick him up on her way to the Verdurins. The little working girl would wait for him near his house at a corner known to his coachman Remy. She would get in beside Swann and stay there in his arms until the moment the carriage drew up in front of the Verdurins. When he came in, as Madame Verdurin, pointing to some roses he had sent that morning, said to him, "You deserve a scolding," and showed him a spot next to Odette. The pianist would play for the two of them the little phrase by Ventois that was like the anthem of their love. He would begin with the sustained violin tremolos that are heard alone for a few measures, occupying the entire foreground. Then all of a sudden they seemed to move away, and as in those paintings by Pieter de Hooch, which assume greater depth because of the narrow frame of a half-open door, away in the distance in a different color in the velvet of an interposed light, the little phrase would appear dancing, pastoral, interpolated, episodic, belonging to another world. It rippled past, simple and immortal, distributing here and there the gifts of its grace with the same ineffable smile. But Swann thought he could now distinguish it with some disenchantment. It seemed to realize how futile this happiness was to which it showed the way. In its light grace there was something finished about it, like the detachment that follows regret. But this hardly mattered to him. He considered the phrase less in itself in what it could express to a musician who was unaware of his existence or of Odette's when he composed it, and to all of those who could hear it, the centuries to come. Then, as a token, a memory of his love, which even for the Verdurins, even for the same young pianist, would remind them of Odette and him, at the same time, would join them together, so much so that when Odette capriciously had begged him to, he had given up the idea of having some pianist play him the entire sonata, of which he knew as yet only this passage. "Why would you need the rest?" she said to him. "This is our piece." And in fact, pained by the thought that at the moment when it passed so close and yet infinitely far away, though it was addressed to them, it did not know them, he was almost sorry it had any meaning, any intrinsic and unalterable beauty, alien to them, just as in the jewels given to us, or even the letters written to us by a woman we love, we resent the water of the gem and the words of the language, because they are not created exclusively from the essence of a passing love affair and a particular person. It often happened that he had lingered so late with the young working girl before going to the Verdurins that after the little phrase had been played by the pianist, Swann would notice that it would be some time, that it would soon be time for Odette to go home. He would drive her back as far as the door of her little house in the Rue de Perrose, behind the Arc de Triomphe. And it was perhaps because of this, in order not to demand all her favors, that he sacrificed the less necessary pleasure of seeing her earlier, of arriving at the Verdurins with her, to the exercise of his right to leave together, which she recognized as his, and to which he attached a greater value, since, because of it, he had the impression that no one else saw her, no one else came between them, stopped her from being with him still, after he left her. And so he would go back in Swann's carriage. She would go back in Swann's carriage one night when she had just stepped down from it and he was saying he would see her tomorrow. She rushed to pick a last chrysanthemum from the little garden in front of the house and gave it to him before he went off. He held it pressed against his lips on the way home, and when after a few days the flower withered, he locked it with great care in his secretary desk. But he never went into her house. Only twice he had gone there in the afternoon to participate in that operation which was of such capital importance for her, having tea. The isolation and emptiness of the short streets, almost all of them lined with some small contiguous private houses, whose monotony would suddenly be interrupted by some sinister street stall, the historic sign and sordid vestige of a time when the districts were still in bad repute, the snow lingering in the garden and on the trees, the slovenliness of the season, the proximity of nature lent something more mysterious to the warmth, the flowers that he had found when he went in. Leaving to the left, on the raised ground floor, Odette's bathroom, which looked out on a little parallel street in the back, a straight staircase between walls painted a dark color and hung with oriental cloths, strings of Turkish beads, and a large Japanese lantern suspended from a slender silk cord, but which, so as not to deprive visitors of the latest comforts of civilization, was lit with gas, led up to a drawing room on the morning room. These were preceded by a narrow vestibule whose wall, checkered by a garden trellis, but a gilded one, was lined down its entire length by a rectangular box in which bloomed, as in a greenhouse, a row of those fat chrysanthemums which were still rare at that time, yet nothing like the ones that horticulturists later succeeded in obtaining. Swann was irritated by the fashion that had favored them since the previous year, but he had taken pleasure this time in seeing the half-light of the room, striped with pink, orange, and white by the fragrant rays of those ephemeral stars which light up on gray days. Odette had received him in a morning gown of pink silk, her neck and arms bare. She had had him sit next to her in one of the many mysterious alcoves that were contrived in the bay of the drawing-room, protested by immense palm trees contained in china catchpots, or by screens festooned with photographs, bows of ribbon, and fans. She had said to him, "You aren't comfortable like that. Wait, I'll fix you up." And with a conceited little laugh, she would have given at some invention of her own, had settled behind Swan's head under his feet, cushions of Japanese silk, which she kneaded as if were lavish with these riches and careless of their own value. But when the valet came, bringing one after another the many lamps, which nearly enclosed in large Chinese vases, burned slightly or in pairs, all on different pieces of furniture, as though on altars, and which had summoned back to the already almost nocturnal twilight of that late afternoon in winter a more lasting sunset, rosier and more human, perhaps making some lover stop and daydream in the street before the mystery of the presence that was at once disclosed and concealed by the glowing panes. She had watched the servant severely from the corner of her eye to see whether he was setting them down properly in their consecrated places. She thought that if even one were put where it should not be, the overall effect of her drawing-room would be ruined, and her portrait, placed on a sloping stand draped in plush, would be poorly lit. And so she fervently followed the movements of the ungainly man and reprimanded him sharply when he went too close to two flower stands, which she took care to clean herself for fear they would be damaged, and which she now went over to examine to see if he had chipped them. She thought all her Chinese knickknacks had amusing shapes, as did the orchids, the cattleyas, especially, which were, along with the chrysanthemums, her favorite flowers, because they had the great merit of not resembling flowers, but being made of silk or satin. "This one looks as though it were cut from the lining of my coat," she said to Swann, showing him an orchid with a suggestion of respect for this very chic flower, for this elegant and unexpected sister which nature had given her, so far removed from her on the scale of living creatures, and yet so refined, more deserving than any woman of being given a place in her drawing-room. As she showed him first chimeras with tongues of fire decorating a vase or embroidered on a screen, then the corollas of a bouquet of orchids, then a dromedary of silver inlaid with niello, with eyes encrusted with rubies that stood on the mantelpiece next to a jade toad. She affected first fear of the wickedness or laughter at the oddity of the monsters, then blushes at the indecency of the flowers, and then an irresistible desire to go and kiss the dromedary and the toad, which she called dears, and these affectations contrasted with the sincerity of certain of her devotions, notably Our Lady of Laquette, who had once, when she lived in Nice, cured her of a fatal illness, and whose gold medal she always wore, attributing to it unlimited powers. Odette made Swann her tea, asking him lemon or cream. And when he answered cream, she said to him, laughing, "A cloud." And when he found it good, "You see I know what you like." This tea, in fact, seemed as precious a thing to Swann as it did to her, and love has such need to find for itself a justification, a guarantee that it will last, in pleasures which, in fact, would not be pleasures without it, and which end when it ends, that when he left her at 7 o'clock to go home and dress during the whole trip that he made in his coupe, unable to contain the joy which the afternoon had given him, he kept repeating to himself how nice it would be to have a little woman like that, in whose home one could always find that rare thing, a good cup of tea. An hour later he received a note from Odette, and immediately recognized the large handwriting, in which an affectation of British stiffness imposed an appearance of discipline on ill-formed letters that would perhaps have signified to less prejudiced eyes an untidiness of mind, an insufficient education, a lack of frankness and resolve. Swann had forgotten his cigarette case at Odette's. If you had forgotten your heart here too, I would not let you have it back. A second visit he made to her was perhaps more important. Going to her house that day, as always when he was to see her, he pictured her to himself beforehand, and his need, if he was to find her face pretty, to limit what he imagined of her cheeks only to her fresh pink cheekbones, since the rest was so often yellow, languid, sometimes marked with red little spots, distressed him, as it seemed to prove that the ideal is inaccessible and happiness mediocre. He had brought her an engraving that she wanted to see. She was a little unwell. She received him in a mauve crepe de chine dressing gown, pulling the richly embroidered material over her chest like a cloak. Standing next to him, allowing her hair, which she had undone, to flow down her cheeks, she assumed the position of a dancer, so that without getting tired she could lean over the engraving, which she looked at, inclining her head with those large eyes of hers, so tired and sullen when she was not animated. She struck Swann by her resemblance to the figure of Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, in a fresco in the Sistine Chapel. Swann had always had this peculiar penchant for amusing himself by rediscovering in the paintings of the masters not only the general characteristics of the real world that surround us, but what seems on the contrary the least susceptible to generalization, the individual features of faces we know. For instance, in the material of a bust of the Dorje Loredano by Antonio Rizzo, the jut of the cheekbones, the slant of the eyebrows, altogether the very evident resemblance to his coachman Remy. Under the colors of Ghirlandaio, Monsieur de Pelancy's nose, in a portrait of Tintoretto, the invasion of the cheeks fat by the first implanted hairs on the side whiskers, the break in the nose, the penetration of the gaze, the congestions of the eyelids, of Dr. de Bourbon. Perhaps because he had always continued to feel a touch of remorse that he had limited his life to worldly relationships, to convention, he believed he could find a sort of indulgent pardon granted him by the great artists, in the fact that they too had contemplated with pleasure, introduced into their work faces like these, which gave it a singular certificate of reality and of truth to life. A modern favor, perhaps, he also allowed himself to be caught so in the frivolity of the social people that he felt the need to look into an old work of art for these anticipated and rejuvenating allusions to current proper names. So I'm going to stop at page 231.